Hi everyone, this is Dr. Richard Dool from the School of Communication and Information at Rutgers University. I'll be talking today about student engagement across cultures. Obviously we're doing this virtually, given the environment we're in, so I'll have to see how this goes. So I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I am a professor at Rutgers University. I also lead two master's programs here. I've been teaching online since 2003. I use what's called a dialogue-intensive model in my classes, and this is particularly important when you go across cultures. I'll talk a lot about that in the presentation. Just a little more background. I had a 35-year corporate career. This is my second career. I've run businesses in about 25 different countries. I spent a lot of time living overseas in the UK, Shanghai in China, and Sao Paulo in Brazil. So I have a little bit of experience across cultures. I also developed and teach several graduate courses here on cross-cultural communication, diversity and globalization, as well as leadership and multiculturalism. I've had more than 500, I'll call them international students in my classes over the years, and largely coming from Eastern Europe, China, India, and a little bit from South America. So why is this topic important? Well, we're seeing a lot more diversity in our classes. We're also seeing different behaviors in our classes across cultures. There's also a lot more scrutiny on faculty, and it's pretty clear that faculty engagement is critical to student learning, and we're obviously going to see growth in online and hybrid courses. So we're going to see more courses online, and we're going to see more multicultural courses. So it seems like a pretty timely topic for us. What I'm going to talk about in this short session is a little bit about diversity in our classrooms, some of the student behaviors you're likely to encounter, has some ideas on how to set up your classroom and what I would call best practices. We'll talk about grading and some of the administrative things, and we'll also talk about some things to consider and to avoid, some mistakes that could be made. Let's start with a fundamental element of the class. It's really our instructors and our attitudes towards difference. If we see diversity as something to comply with, to manage, to accept, to tolerate, or even blend, or even mitigate, it's going to affect the tone and the quality of the experience of our classes. If we see it about celebrating diversity, embracing and leveraging it, and exposing the beauty of diversity across our student bodies, student learners, I think you'll see a much more positive experience. So a lot depends on our attitude, as I mentioned, about diversity in our classrooms. There's an old saying that I like to use: we do not see things as they are, we see things as we are. And that's really a key point here, is we have to kind of broaden our own perspective. I call it the global mindset in our classes, and to think beyond, in my case, Rutgers University in New Brunswick, New Jersey, and think about, I have global students from all kinds of ethnic backgrounds in my classes. How do I make this a positive learning experience for them? So we'll start with what I call the global mindset. I like this quote a lot. It's called the global mindset is being uncomfortable with being uncomfortable in uncomfortable places. And what that means is we're going to get into areas sometimes in these classes where we're just not that comfortable. We don't know enough about that culture. We don't know enough about that particular individual's background and their worldview. We don't know how two cultures may clash in our classroom. So it's important that we kind of have a broad mindset. And again, I called it the global mindset. You'll see on one of the slides, a global mindset is defined as being having a tolerance for ambiguity, being culturally curious, being very self-aware and a bit humble, having an ability to adapt to your class size and your student population, having a passion for diversity, and also developing relationships with the students in your class. I have a little box on the right there you'll see called culturally: being open, being curious, being respectful, being knowledgeable, and ultimately being savvy in how you teach your students in your classroom. This next slide talks about building a positive attitude towards diversity in your classes. And I put this in deliberately because we have to embrace diversity in these classes. We have to be really excited about it, feel good about it, be curious about it, be looking forward to the experience with our students. So they'll get that energy from us, they'll get that passion from us. And they'll also get the idea that we have to look beyond ourselves and consider multiple worldviews in this. We want to be careful not to be too ethnocentric in these things, do too much American models and American examples, and try to be more global in some of the things that we do. Now I have a series of slides here on setting up our classroom. I'll go through those in a little detail here. So first, as I mentioned, it all starts with the tone, the attitude and style that you set. Your phrasing should be welcoming and open and positive and encouraging. You have to be very clear and concise and concrete in your word choices. Use more neutral words. Be careful not to use local lingo or colloquialisms or sports analogies, for example, which we do a lot here in the U.S. We also want to encourage a lot of interaction from the first communication. Now, you should know, and I'm sure some of you have experienced this, not every student comes into the classroom willing to participate. Some of them are culturally uncomfortable doing that, especially if they're from a high context culture like China or Japan, where there's also what I would call a high power distance. In other words, they have a lot of respect for the professor, and they feel like if they ask you something or participate in discussion sometimes, somehow that's insulting. Somehow they're going across the line between student and faculty. So you got to be a little careful about that. There's a lot of good reading out there you can do on high context and low context cultures, and this whole concept of power distance and that dynamic between professor and student. The other thing you're going to have to decide, a key balance decision, is rigor and flexibility. How are you going to be flexible to adapt to a multicultural class with still upholding the rigor of the learning objectives for your program? Because sometimes they will come and clash, and they will clash with each other. So you definitely want to think that through, and I'll give some examples as I go through. Now, in every online class particularly, the discussion is a classroom, as you know, whether you're doing it synchronously, live Zoom sessions, for example, or like this WebEx session, or if you're doing it asynchronously. So it's not live but available 24/7. A key decision is how you're going to structure and frame the discussion. You have to consider the cultural considerations of this, because could be a challenge at times where some students will not participate as much as you like. You're going to have to be very explicit on your discussion expectations. That means being really clear on the rubric for discussions in your syllabus, and I'll talk about that later. I literally have 4 pages of discussion expectations in my syllabus to make it absolutely clear to the students. You're going to see in the slides there are 3 different ways to set up your discussions. I call the first one, in the black there, the Q&A model. And that is where the professor post a question, and the students respond to that question. There's really not a lot of interaction. It's really just more like a research exercise. They'll do a homework, and they post a homework assignment. I don't consider that very interactive, but it is used out there. There's another one in the orange box called the 1+ model, where the student responds to the faculty member or to the posted question and to at least one peer. We use that a lot at Rutgers. Again, I'm not a big fan of that one either, but it does get used a lot. So a lot of our professors use a method called you post your response to the discussion question on Thursday and to 2 peers on Friday. Okay, that's not bad. It's got some limited interactive capability. It does get the students comfortable. The international students are particularly comfortable with that because it's more a research exercise than a real dialogue. I happen to use the one in green called the dialog-intensive model because I strongly believe that peer-to-peer learning is a powerful and rich learning experience, and I want them to interact with each other. I want them to share their experiences, their insights, their perspectives, sources, other research material. So there's a lot that goes on in my classes with this dialogue-intensive model. It takes the international students a little bit to get used to it because I definitely want them to engage, but it's been working for me well over the last 10 years or so, so it's definitely one to consider. So if you're going to consider one of these two of these, consider the 1+, maybe extend that a little bit, and the dialogue. I'd avoid the Q&A model. Once you decide that, you have to also decide the right the right discussion questions. You want a discussion question that engenders a different approach and allows room for different answers. It does not call for a specific answer. It's not a yes/no clearly. It needs some reflection, some thought. It encourages the student to bring in other experiences and their insights, etc. And it encourages interaction. So you have to make it very clear. You should make it one topic. In my case, I do it 1 topic per week. So in a 15-week semester, we'll have 15 discussion areas, each week. I have 1 topic per week, so it doesn't get too complicated. And it's got to leave room for interaction, go down different tangents depending on what the students post. And you as a facilitator can take what they post and turn in different directions to kind of promote your dialogue, if you will. The other thing is you have to really, as I mentioned this earlier, really set up the expectations on discussions. You should weight it pretty aggressively. I weighted at 30% of my classes. We go down as low as 15%, but it's substantive. You can decide whether you want to grade each discussion unit by week, for example. I don't do that. I tend to do mine every fourth or fifth week, but there's lots of ways to do that. But put enough weight that they know you're serious, that then discussions matter in your class. You also want to be careful about the balance between knowing and doing. Knowing and doing. Knowing is something they can source out. They can research and post a researched answer, if you will. A lot of the international students tend to do that. The doing answers tend to be, how do you apply that information? What experiences have you had? What examples could you share? Is there a scenario or vignette you could use? You really want to balance between those two. That makes the discussions really sing. You're likely to see more formal and longer postings from the international students than more dialogue oriented. You're going to need to encourage them to jump into the dialogue. You also have to set the tone for and the rules for discussion etiquette about language and respect for discussion area, respect for individuals, and make sure the tone is correct. I'll talk a little bit about that in another slide. The other point you also want to make sure in your syllabus, in your rubric, is have a pretty clear standard for quality and quantity. It's not just about posting 5 times in a week. It's also having good quality and extending the conversation, extending the discussion. So I use both. I have a quality and quantity metric because every student wants to know, well, if I only post 5 times, will that be an A? That's not good enough. You could post 15 times and still not get an A if the quality is not any good. So it's that balance between the two that's really important. One of the other things you're going to see, which makes this a kind of interesting and sometimes frustrating experience, is a lot of different student behaviors. I've listed about 10 here. I'm not going to go through all of them, but you'll get the idea. You'll get the invisible man, I call him or her, who tries to hide and doesn't participate that much. Well, it might, you can hide in the last row in a class on campus, in a night course maybe. You can't hide in an online discussion. As an online instructor, you're going to realize pretty quickly who's participating and who isn't. A lot of the systems have metrics you can check to see if they're, how often they're in, how long they're in. So they're not going to be helpful to us. So you got to make it clear in your syllabus. You need to participate. In mine, for example, I say you must participate 4 of the 5 days a week. Because I use a week as my discussion area. You also have what I call Jane Come Lately. These are the ones that post madly in the last 2 days on Thursday and Friday, for example, and they'll post 6 or 7 times because they want that good grade, but they don't really extend the discussion. It doesn't help us when everyone else has been in from Monday and they're only coming in Thursday and Friday posting like crazy. That's not helpful. Then you'll also see some really annoying ones like the devil's advocate who likes to normally complain or challenge every assumption. It could be done nicely and it could be done normally and that could be useful, but sometimes if it's overdone, it's annoying. You also have the contrarian who just decides to argue on every point. They can be really disruptive, so keep an eye on those two. The dominator is another one. Let's say in your case, in my case, for example, 8 postings of good quality could be an A, but they post 15 times or 18 times in a week. That dominator can be intimidating to other students. So you want to make sure that you look at and kind of facilitate those behaviors. And you also have the therapy seeker. Believe it or not, some students see this as a therapy session. You got to be careful between the line of privacy and too much personal information. And the last one you'll notice on the right there, you'll see some tribe-like tendencies where a lot of the students tend to respond to their peers from their own culture, or they'll tend to respond to using just their own cultural examples. So you want to make sure you keep an eye on that and try and facilitate them into thinking more broadly. Now, you have a bunch of roles as a professor, as a facilitator, instructor in these online classes. I have 4 of them listed here, 5 of them listed here, pardon me. One is you're the diversity respect champion. So you got to be out there constantly, encouraging diversity, encouraging the diverse perspectives, and making sure they're respecting all the perspectives. You're the facilitator. You're kind of the source of energy. You're also the boundary setter. You're keeping people on track, making sure they stay within their expectation for discussion that week, and they're not getting too far off track. You're also kind of the traffic cop, as I call it, regulating the flow, make sure people are not too little too late. You're also the chief cheerleader. You're out there praising them, encouraging them to go forward. So you're modeling the way, and you got to be in there every day. So in my case, I say you have to be in there actively, and that's 4 to 5 days a week. I'm in every day. Discussion's open. Try and create a very positive, encouraging environment. Ask questions, comment, but make sure you're being culturally sensitive as you do that to encourage people to participate. Now here are a range of some other best practices you might want to consider. Definitely use an introduction. I use something called tell us a bit about you, where you're from, what you do, tell us about your family, tell us why you're in the program, tell us something interesting about you or something we need to know, something like that. Definitely post a picture up. Make sure you put your office hours in, or you have a question area for both personal and general questions. And make sure your syllabus is quite detailed and explicit. Maybe even want to overdo it a little bit, particularly around assignments. I notice in a lot of the international students, they're very curious and they want to make sure they have a lot of detail, more than you're probably comfortable doing. So I tend to overdo mine a little bit. And then also post that syllabus as early as you can, not just the day class opens if you can. Try and do it a week earlier. The other thing you might want to consider is what I call the rule of 3. I remind students all the time, at least 3 times, on anything I want them to know. So I'll have something in my syllabus. I'll have an announcement on it in the classroom, and I'll also might send out an email or a text. I also use things like weekly checklists. Here's everything you need to know this week, student. This is how you can get yourself organized. I use frequently asked questions. I use reminders. So I'm constantly telling them. Part of me says this is the excuse eliminator. I didn't know kind of excuse. How could you not know? I posted it 3 different places for you. So I make it very clear about that. I also post a document called How to Navigate Our Class, so they know where to find all this stuff. The more you can use video, the better. The more they see you and can hear you, the better. So you can use it for lectures, introductions. I tend to use it to introduce each lesson each week, and sometimes on a lesson itself. As I mentioned earlier, you definitely want to have rubrics if you can, or at least have good assignment descriptions and good assignment details. Another thing to think about is the workloads and the due dates. In a graduate class I teach, I usually have about 5 or 6 graded assignments. I spread them out over the 3 months of the semester. I don't back end load it too much, so I kind of make it's almost like one a month, a little one every 6 weeks or so, just to make sure they can spread the work out. I'm trying to be sensitive to other classes. You also want to be very explicit on, are you going to accept late assignments? And if not, what the penalty would be. Or if you are going to accept it, what the penalty would be. If you're not going to accept it, make sure that's really clear. If you use group assignments, which I use in all my classes, be careful about tribe-like behavior. They'll tend to congregate. So if you let them self-select, they will self-select all on their own cultural lines, more than likely. So I don't do that. I assign mixed teams deliberately. So I make sure that I get some cross diversity, if you will, in these classes. I also make sure I make sure they have to operate visibly in these group assignments so I can see who's participating. So using a Google Doc or sometimes you're using Canvas, for example, you use a conference feature. The other thing you're going to have to be really clear about is APA. A lot of our international students don't understand APA or have not even used it at the undergrad level, for example. They think something online is perfectly acceptable to use as is, so they don't understand the notion of citation and references. So you have to be really clear about that. You have to make sure you have a statement in your syllabus about that. If you're going to grade using APA, make sure it's in your rubric. You might want to use a tool like Turnitin. And you also have to think about commission versus omission. Was this a deliberate attempt to plagiarize, or was it just they didn't understand? So I'm careful about that. In my case, in our program, I tend to see some, maybe a handful of these each year, and 90% of them are omission. They just didn't understand it. So be clear about APA if you're going to hold that as a standard in your assignments. One that you have to be particularly careful about is using culturally sensitive assignments. This has been a problem many times, and I've seen in classes from other professors, and even myself, I've made some mistakes on. You want to avoid some political and controversial topics. You want to be careful about being too American and try and find more global examples or globally sensitive ones. You might even allow students to develop their own so they can develop it within their own cultural expectations and worldview. If you have exemplars or example papers and you want to share them, that's a really good idea. You also could decide whether you're going to allow rework. I notice more international students request a chance to repost or to redraft after the first one. I don't particularly do that in my class. I don't allow extra credit assignments and I don't allow rework, but I have other professors that do. So think about that. But be careful about your culturally sensitive assignments, if you will. You also want to be really clear about your grading. How you're going to grade content and concepts. Are you going to grade application of the concepts? How much weight are you going to put on the writing? Remember, a lot of these students, English is their second or third language. Their writing may be more formal. So I tend to be I give a little flexibility on the writing for my international students. I don't quite hold to the exact standard I hold in American. I try and find that balance between rigor and sensitivity and rigor and flexibility. But that's a decision you're going to have to make. Are you going to hold them to a more American standard of writing or something that's more global? As I mentioned about APA as well. You also want to make sure your feedback is really clear, very specific, and very timely. I notice a lot of the international students want more feedback than we're typically used to, and they want more detail and they want more suggestions. So I would also ask you to consider using a very encouraging and constructive tone in your feedback and give enough detail that they can do something with it. Now, some professors in our program give weekly feedback. I typically don't. I usually do 3 or 4 times across the semester, but that's a choice you can make and decide whether you want to handle it or not. Just to wrap up a little bit here. So what are some mistakes you can avoid? Well, one, clearly the biggest one is being culturally insensitive. So just always check yourself and check your assumptions and check, am I really thinking this through, that multiple cultures can be comfortable with this? We don't want to see and treat all students as one type student. We want to see them as they individually are, and we want to celebrate that diversity. We want to be very careful about being very consistent in our engagement, so we're present all the time, we're active and positive. I've seen a lot of professors get in trouble on this and get some bad feedback because they're very erratic. They're in and out. They're not consistently engaged, or they're not very responsive to an email or to a question from a student. Also, be careful about inadvertently embarrassing a student. And if you do, be very careful and very comfortable apologizing for that and calling yourself out and calling other students out in a respectful way, so we don't feel no one feels embarrassed, but they also feel like you have their back and you're going to help them and support them. And last but not least on this one is make sure there's enough detail in your classes. A detailed syllabus, a detailed class setup, a lot of detail in the assignments, because I notice a lot of our international students want more detail, not less. They want more prescription, not less prescription. So I hope this was a good experience for you. Kind of short, obviously. We're doing this virtually. I put my email on here, my LinkedIn contact as well. I'm happy to help you if anything comes up. And if you need any help with anything, feel free. Hopefully it was good for everybody. Thank you.